Welcome everyone to week 1 of Smaugust 2023. So what in the world is this? I hear a lot of you asking, as this is admittedly not my usual genre of art. Let me explain. Although many of you probably already know what Smaugust is, as I'm far from the first artist to participate in this annual community challenge, Smaugust, put simply, is a drawing challenge that takes place during the month of August, hence the name, where I will be drawing one dragon a day for the next 31 days. Many of you may be familiar with the DIY dragon manual video from How to Train Your Dragon that I made a few years ago, but due to the fact that I didn't focus that much on the drawing aspect that was involved in that project during its own video, I was never quite satisfied with the end product. I reasoned then that to scratch this dragon drawing itch, I should do a Smaugust challenge for you all, with a prompt list based on the dragons that can be found in that book from the movie. I designed this prompt list to follow the general order of dragons shown in the book, and I'll walk you through my reasoning behind the order that I followed. Following the scene from the movie, it was pretty easy to place the first group of dragons. Number 1 was super easy, as according to the movie, the first page after the table of contents is the Thunderdrum. Then Hiccup appears to skip a few pages, and then we have a big chunk of dragons. The Timberjack, the Scauldron, the Changewing, the Gronkle, and the hideous Zippleback. At this point, he again skips a few pages between each dragon, but we do get to see a few of the ones in this section: the Skrill, the Bone Napper, and the Whispering Death. We don't get to see the dragons on the following pages, but we very importantly hear some vague descriptions of the terrible things that the Vikings of Birth think that these dragons do to people. One burns its victims, one buries its victims, and the final one chokes its victims and turns them inside out. Wonderful. These last two descriptions appear to be of the same dragon, as he doesn't turn the page between the two individual descriptions. He then very quickly flies through the rest of the book, as it's hard to get a good understanding of what dragons he's seeing in this section. Except for a few pages before the Night Fury, we see a 4-headed dragon that later on in the series we learn is called the Snap Trapper. A few pages before we finally land on the Night Fury, which I always assumed was the last one in the book when I was a kid. Now to fill in the blanks, which are... well, there's a lot of blanks actually, and we don't have that much information. Going back to the dragons that we just heard descriptions of earlier on in the book, I think it's not a complete shot in the dark to say that the burns its victims dragon might be the Monstrous Nightmare, as although the vast majority of dragons in How to Train Your Dragon can shoot fire and thus burn their victims, the Monstrous Nightmare is specifically noted in the intro of the first film to set itself on fire, which I think might translate to some sort of attack like this. The final two were a lot harder to place, as no two dragons in the series are ever specifically noted to behave like this. Though my initial thought was that the buries its victims dragon might be the Whispering Death, as it can often be seen digging through the ground, we already saw it earlier on in the book. I then took buries its victims in a less literal way to maybe mean like it crushes its opponents under itself, which is something that we see the Hot Purple doing later in the series. The final one was a complete shot in the dark, because we never hear of someone being strangled to death and turned inside out, probably because this is a series for kids. But if any dragon looks like it might be capable of such an act, it might be the Thornridge, because I mean, oof, look at that thing, that's horrifying. The final group were dragons that were honestly anybody's guess, so it was up to me to place them where I thought they were best fit. Seeing that there were a lot of water-based dragons earlier on in the book, I placed some there, as well as took many of the dragons from the first movie and largely placed them as far to the early side of the list as I could, reasoning that these species in particular were more natively found in Berk, as they were common enough to be both found and captured for the training arena in the first movie. I then added the dragons from the shows in the other two movies as I saw fit, particularly exotic dragons like the Night Fury, Bone Snarl, and Stormcutter could be found towards the end, of course, and the final slot behind the Night Fury I placed the green or the red Death. I placed it here because I don't think this dragon would have been in the book that Hiccup read, as based on the character reactions to seeing that dragon for the first time, I think that I hadn't discovered it until this point in time. Transversely, I placed the Bewilderbeast, a dragon with a similar biological niche, earlier on the list, as when Hiccup reunites with his mother in the second movie, she lists out the dragons found in her sanctuary by species name, including the Bewilderbeast, and Hiccup doesn't seem too surprised by its presence. Anyways, over-analyzing a fictional book and a children's movie aside, that's how I made the list for this month. If you wish to participate in this Smaugust challenge using my list, I posted it both here on the community tab of the YouTube channel and on my Discord. There, in the Smaugust 2023 tab, you can show off your art for this month's drawing challenge. Of course, you don't have to use my list to participate. You can follow another list or make up your own. And honestly, you don't even have to draw every day. The challenge is, of course, about having fun and growing as an artist through drawing dragons. Enough preamble, however. Now on to the first 5 dragons of Smaugust 2023. With this challenge, I wanted each of my dragons to have a consistent art style. I was going to try to develop one that wasn't too far from the main How to Train Your Dragon style, but took some elements from real-world animals to inform a more realistic anatomy. Of course, this wouldn't mean that I was redesigning these entirely, more like making art of existing creatures that would be found in a more modern field guide. Almost like a halfway point between two of my favorite artists, R.J. Palmer's realistic Pokemon series, and Jack Burke's own Smaugust art from Subjectively in the years past. For day 1, Thunderdrum, I took inspiration from whale sharks, as their wide, filter-feeding mouths looked very similar to the one on the Thunderdrums. Where the real-life whale shark's mouth is for passively feeding itself, the Thunderdrum's mouth plays a more fantastical role, as it is explained that they can produce concussive shockwaves from within their bodies and aim them using their mouths like the horn of a brass instrument. The eyes and tail were reminiscent of an anglerfish, as I always imagined this as a deep-sea creature, even though it was specifically stated to be a shallow water creature. Actually, now that I think about it, though, I always imagined this dragon as being more of the size of a whale shark. It is stated that they live in large tide pools, so maybe they're a lot smaller than I think they are. Who knows? With these earlier art pieces, I was still messing around with the art style that I wanted them to have, but in the end I found a page layout that I decided would work for all of them. Day 2 Deadly Nadder was one of these earlier ones where I didn't have the art style quite down yet. But not only did I know a lot more about this dragon, it being one of the main ones from the first movie, it also had some easily defined features that translated well into the style that I wanted to use. This dragon has a bipedal stance reminiscent of popular depictions of raptoid dinosaurs, so this dragon took very little tweaking for me to be happy with. The spikes on the tail were more of a challenge and one that I wasn't super happy with the outcome of, although basing the shape off of porcupine quills made for a pretty good look in the end. Krita, the art program that I use, has a scale pattern brush that I went on to use for many of the other dragons that I did, and I used it first here to give this dragon the right texture, and I'm super happy with this aspect of the design. That being said, similarly to day 1, I was still trying to place my art style for the series, and as such, I think this piece suffered a little bit, as it doesn't look as polished as some of the others. Either way, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. Day 3 was where I really hit my stride, settling on an art style that I was comfortable using for the rest of the series. Funnily enough, This happened with a dragon that I was entirely unfamiliar with. The Seashocker was a dragon that I found on the Wikipedia page that I had never heard of before. I believe it was one of the dragons from the later TV shows that I honestly haven't watched, but either way, I included it because, well, it looks really cool. This water-based dragon was very fun to draw. I found its shape best resembled that of a manta ray, with the double heads in place of the protuberances in front of their mouths. This was also the first dragon that I used the scale brush to its fullest potential on, by scaling them down to the proper size and layering them to get more reflective looking surfaces on certain parts of the body where there might be more glare off of these scales. I didn't realize this when I made the list, but 4 out of the 5 week 1 dragons are blue. I didn't do that on purpose, but I guess a big reason for that was the presence of many sea-based dragons earlier in the book. Anyway, I feel like my only real gripe with week 1 is the lack of diversity in the color palettes of each of these dragons. Either way, here's day 3. With day 4 Timberjack, we return to the group of dragons that came directly from the scene in the movie. The concept of this dragon is really neat. In a dragon that doesn't use its fire as its main form of attack, rather it uses the razor-sharp edge of the front of its wings as a sickle-like blade to cut through surfaces. It is specifically noted to be able to cut through fully grown trees. Even with the cool concept, this was not the easiest dragon to pull off. In fact, it was probably my least favorite of all the ones I did for this first week. Originally, I wasn't going to let myself redo this one, as the whole point of the challenge is that there's a time crunch and you have to stop needlessly perfecting. Being said, my first version was just horrendous, so I redid it, and this second version is the one that you're seeing now. I learned from looking at reference of this dragon that it has no apparent legs, that it was more of a serpent with wings like many Eastern depictions of dragons. And I based the look of the wings off of a mix of bat wings and by the implied shape of the wings that can be found on pterodactyl fossils, as they seem to have this similar lower leg wing attachment protuberance that this dragon has. I actually really like that a few of the dragons that the team for the real movies created seem to be inspired by multiple different historical depictions of dragons, as well as different creatures on the planet. There's a few here that aren't entirely Norse inspired, and yeah, a lot of them are just based around modern ideas related to dragons anyways, but I've still got to give them props. The final prompt of the week was day 5, Scauldron, and I was particularly excited for this one. For the context, the first movie came out when I was around 8 or 9, and so I was the target audience. Not only that, most of my heritage is Nordic, and I'm sort of obsessed with learning about that area of the world, both real history and fantasy, and as such, I'm a sucker for that Viking aesthetic. So as expected, I was immediately obsessed with the idea of a world like this that was presented in How to Train Your Dragon. I, of course, had a favorite dragon, the Scauldron. The thought of a dragon that could shoot boiling water instead of fire was such a cool idea to my little kid brain that I fantasized for years too long about having my own Scauldron dragon. It just seemed like a creature made specifically for me. With the Viking aesthetic in the aquatic setting, this would be the type of dragon that if you condensed all of my tastes and interests down onto and made it into a dragon, this would be pretty close to what it would be. I probably failed to realize that keeping a dragon like this in my house would both destroy my house and kill the dragon, as I don't have a pool big enough to keep one alive, but hey, a kid can dream. Crazy rant aside, I am really quite happy with how my depiction of this dragon turned out. Vaguely plesiosaurian inspired, I gave it these little limbs based on frog legs, and I extended its wings lengthwise so that they'd resemble something that might actually be found on an aquatic animal. Making a pose that I reasoned would be that of a creature in an underwater setting, I allowed myself to make a more dynamic looking character, and I'm really pleased with how it came out. So that is week 1 of Smaugust. Yes, I know that this video is out on the 3rd, which means that the last 2 should be week 2 dragons, but I allowed myself to go a bit ahead of schedule in interest of getting you guys some Smaugust content earlier on in the week, and hopefully on a consistent basis. Thursday seemed like the best day for me to do this, so hopefully I'll get all of these out on time in the end. Again, to anyone who is participating in Smaugust, I encourage you to go look at the Smaugust chat in the Discord and share your own dragon art there, as I'd love to see them. I'll see you next Thursday for week 2, and as always, I hope you liked this video. If you did, then leave a like, and if you want to stick around, then feel free to subscribe and turn on the bell to get notified when I upload next.